In AD 46, the missionaries set sail from Seleucia and traveled 100 miles southwest to the island of Cyprus, Barnabas' birthplace, the third largest island in the Mediterranean, prosperous in copper mines. In the west coast town of Paphos, they met a sorcerer named Bar-Jesus, his Greek name being Elymas. Paul and Barnabas had been invited to bring their message to Governor Sergius Paulus, but Bar-Jesus urged the governor not to listen. Paul was outraged. Paul called Bar-Jesus an enemy of all righteousness, saying that the hand of the Lord was upon him and that he would be blind for a season. Bar-Jesus was now blind, stumbling about in confusion and helplessness. The governor became an instant believer.
The missionaries sailed to Turkey, landing at the port town of Perga. Then John Mark, for some unexplained reason, returned to Jerusalem. Paul and Barnabas went on 100 miles north to the Pisidian Antioch, located in the Roman province of Galatia, a trade center with a large Jewish population, and Paul spoke out boldly there about the good news. The people at the synagogue asked Paul to return to them the following week, and almost the entire city came out to hear him. The Jewish leaders, jealous of the enormous crowd, argued against everything that Paul said. Paul and Barnabas told them that the good news was to be given to the Jews first, but since they rejected it, they would offer it to the Gentiles.
The Gentiles rejoiced in the message, but the Jewish leaders incited a mob that drove the missionaries out of town. Paul and Barnabas shook the dust from their feet and moved on to Iconium, a commercial center on the road between Asia and Syria. They preached boldly there, but the message was received with mixed reactions. Some became believers, others backed the Jewish leaders. Soon they learned that there was a plot underway to have them stoned to death, so they fled for their lives, going 25 miles south to Lystra.
As the scriptures say, if anyone is going to boast, let him boast about what the Lord has done and not about himself. When someone boasts about himself and how well he has done, well, it doesn't count for much. But when the Lord commends him, that's different. The Apostle Paul, 2 Corinthians 10, the 17th and 18th verses.
In Lystra, AD 46, as Paul was preaching, he noticed a crippled man and, realizing that he had the faith to be healed, asked him to stand up. The man leaped to his feet and started walking, overcome with joy. The crowds were amazed, convinced that the missionaries must be gods, Barnabas being the Greek god Jupiter and Paul being Mercury. The local priest prepared to sacrifice oxen to them at the city gates before the crowds. Paul and Barnabas were stunned, desperately trying to convince the people that they were mere human beings there to bring them the message of salvation.
Yet only a few days later, some Jews from Iconium and the Pisidian Antioch, still angry over Paul's preaching in their cities, converged on Lystra. The crowd stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, presuming him to be dead. Though badly beaten, he managed to get up and return to Lystra. The next day, the missionaries traveled to Derbe, then retraced their steps back to Antioch in Syria. The first missionary journey had taken 2 years and covered approximately 1,500 miles.
In Antioch, some men from Judea arrived and began to teach the believers that they had to adhere to the Jewish custom of circumcision, or they could not be saved. Paul and Barnabas argued and discussed this with them at great length. Believers finally sent the missionaries, along with some local men, to talk to the elders and apostles in Jerusalem about this question. They came back with a letter declaring that the Gentiles did not need to have this burden laid upon them.
In Antioch, AD 50, Paul suggested to Barnabas that they return to Turkey to see how the new converts were getting along. Barnabas agreed and suggested that John Mark accompany them on this second missionary journey. Paul was opposed to that idea, still disappointed that John Mark had deserted them in Pamphylia. The disagreement was so strong that they separated, and Barnabas and John Mark sailed for Cyprus. Paul chose Silas, a young disciple from Antioch, as his traveling companion, and they set off for 3 years of preaching the good news.
Paul and Silas traveled the Roman road through Cilicia and the Cilician Gates, a gorge through the Tarsus Mountains, and then on to Derbe and Lystra. In Lystra, Paul met Timothy, a believer who was well thought of by the believers in Lystra and Iconium, and who had become a lifelong student and friend. Paul asked him to join the missionaries on their journey, and they went from city to city, making known the decision concerning the Gentiles, watching the church grow daily in faith and numbers.
Paul, Silas, and Timothy traveled to Phrygia and Galatia because the Holy Spirit had told them not to go to the Turkish province of Asia Minor at this time. Then, going along the borders of Mysia, they headed north to the province of Bithynia. But again, the Holy Spirit said no. So instead, they went through Mysia to the city of Troas, where they met the apostle Luke, who would eventually tell Paul's story in the book of Acts.
That night, Paul had a vision. In his dream, he saw a man standing over Macedonia in Greece, pleading with Paul to come there because they were in great need of help. The missionaries concluded that God wanted the good news preached there.
In everything you do, stay away from complaining and arguing, so that no one can speak a word of blame against you. You are to live clean, innocent lives as children of God in a dark world full of people who are crooked and stubborn. Shine out among them like beacon lights, holding out to them the word of life. The Apostle Paul, Philippians 2, the 14th through 17th verses.